This is week 4 of International Politics of Climate Change, and it's great to have you back as we explore the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. Now, as I speak today, new US President Joe Biden has just signed an executive order bringing the United States back into the Paris Agreement, reversing the Trump administration's earlier withdrawal. The US withdrawal was a major blow for the UNFCCC regime at the time, and their return to the fold offers renewed hope that global efforts to coordinate climate mitigation and adaptation might finally gain some momentum. However, the question remains, are our existing international institutions and practices of multilateral diplomacy up to the task of governing a global climate change response? Let's see. Here's our agenda for this video. First, I'll introduce the idea that the UNFCCC process can be thought of as a two-level game. I'll then document the emergence of international responses to climate change from the origins of climate science back in the 19th century to the birth of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the late 1980s. It's at this time also that the UNFCCC was born. I'll pick up this story and explain how the UNFCCC works and evaluate the Paris Agreement, which is the latest instrument to emerge from the UNFCCC process. Negotiating bilateral treaties between just two countries on any single issue is difficult enough. So imagine the complexity of nearly 200 countries attempting to agree on a climate change treaty that covers a multitude of issues which touches on nearly every dimension of public policy and human experience. So how do we make sense of this complexity? Well, to do this, I want to draw your attention to how international negotiations can function like a two-level game. This two-level game concept was made prominent by US academic Robert Putnam in the late 1980s in a very famous article. And this concept refers to the need for governments to adopt negotiating positions in multilateral forums that will satisfy both domestic and foreign audiences. At the international level, national governments seek to maximize their own ability to satisfy domestic pressures while minimizing the adverse political consequences of multilateral cooperation on their national interests. So much of what appears irrational at the international level can be explained by considering the way in which national bargaining positions reflect a contest of interests in their domestic politics. So foreign policymakers not only need to consider what's good policy, but also what's good politics, and they're sensitive to the interests of powerful domestic factions. Now this becomes problematic when good politics becomes damaging to good policy. The balance of possibilities in the UNFCCC process is always in flux. Negotiating teams can only go so far as their domestic constituencies will allow. And this is because states are not unitary actors. We can think of the state like a social ecosystem of competing economic, political, bureaucratic, and public interests. At the national level, domestic groups pursue their interests by pressuring the government to adopt favourable policies, and politicians seek power by constructing coalitions among those groups. So this graphic here gives you a rough idea of what that process might look like. So in the UNFCCC, to execute a successful negotiation, national negotiating teams can only promise or they can only concede as much as their domestic constituents will support. There's a number of factors that shape the domestic political calculus. So for one, a state's negotiating position can be shaped by the dominant ideology that shapes their political culture and how their leaders view the outside world. So ideological compatibility is a key ingredient to the legitimacy and the acceptance of international agreements by domestic publics. Highly politicized ideological competition in domestic politics can make governments unable or unwilling to advance strong positions in international treaty negotiations. And this is where we can see the damage that climate denial and the culture war bullshit that we've seen over the last 20 years, what this has done to the UNFCCC process to slow it down. While the political process is important and ideology is important, it's usually the structure of national economies that ultimately determines the distribution of power within a given state. Now, this power distribution depends on a number of factors. So, how diverse is the national economy and what are the dominant industries? Does a country have sizable domestic markets or is it dependent on exports? And if it is export dependent, what kind of products does it export? What are the dominant sectors? These factors define what a country's key national interests are likely to be, and the most important political constituencies that influence policy formation. So those key stakeholders are likely to have a disproportionate influence over the political process through mechanisms like lobby groups, think tanks, campaign financial contributions, or the revolving door of personal links between industry and government, as well as some outright corruption. The state's negotiating position can depend on the state of play in the domestic political process. So questions like who's winning and who's losing in the domestic political cycle are important. And what's the timing of the political cycle? So is there an election coming up, or is there a leadership transition that's just happened? What are the personalities of the key leaders, and what kind of factional interests are at play behind the scenes of domestic politics? So all of these factors make a difference to a state's substantive bargaining position and the relative bargaining leverage that they might have in the UNFCCC. This one might resonate with fans of The Office or Veep or Utopia or The Hollow Men, TV shows and movies that critique government bureaucracy. And this is because bureaucracy can also be a constraining influence on a state's negotiating position in international forums. Foreign policy positions are often based on bargaining and compromises between competing government agencies. And this can often produce suboptimal policy outcomes because they're a lowest common denominator bargain. They're a compromise. And this happens because government departments are always competing for funding, and they're competing with each other for primacy in the policy agenda. They've got different interests and different organisational cultures, and all of this combined makes whole of government coordination really difficult. So in a treaty regime like the UNFCCC, the result of bureaucratic bargaining within states can be national negotiating positions that appear irrational, but which are likely to be the most optimal outcome given the domestic, political and bureaucratic constraints. Finally, public pressure can influence a state's international stance through various mechanisms including elections, opinion polls, engagement with politicians and public correspondence in the media, as well as direct action demonstrations of public will through civil society and social movements. Now, as a rule, individual citizens on their own tend to have very little direct influence on the political process. So public pressure exerts the most political leverage when citizens act collectively and form broad coalitions to influence policy formation. So this is also helped by non-government organisations who can influence the policy agenda because they've got greater organisational capacity. They can draw on size and more financial backing, as well as knowledge and experience, media connections, and relationships with people within the apparatus of government. Altering the balance of power among domestic constituents is pivotal to compelling government to supporting stronger negotiations in the UNFCCC. A position that is congruent with the urgency of the climate crisis. You might be surprised to learn that awareness of anthropogenic climate change dates back to the 19th century. As early as 1824, the French mathematician Joseph Fourier argued that surface heat on the Earth was maintained by the atmosphere, anticipating what we call today the greenhouse effect. In 1859, the Irish physicist John Tyndall identified the role of water vapour, carbon dioxide and methane in maintaining atmospheric temperature. So these are the active agents in the greenhouse effect. In 1896, Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius named the greenhouse effect and accurately calculated the relationship between changes in carbon dioxide levels and atmospheric temperature. Now, incidentally, Arrhenius is the great-grandfather of current-day climate champion Greta Thunberg. In 1925, American statistician Alfred James Lotka described the possibility of human influence in altering the global climate system. By the late 1950s, with the aid of improved computers and improved technology for scientific measurements, more scientists were starting to argue that carbon dioxide emissions could be a problem. In 1972, the seminal Club of Rome report, Limits to Growth, warned about the long-term negative ecological and climatological effects of the exponential growth of man-made greenhouse gas pollution. Not long after that, in 1979, both the World Meteorological Association and the US National Research Council published reports documenting temperature changes in the lower atmosphere that correlated to rising CO2 concentrations. In 1985, a joint UN Environment Programme and World Meteorological Organization conference concluded that greenhouse gases were expected to cause significant warming in the next century. In 1988, the NASA scientist James Hansen, who's pictured here, made one of the first assessments that human-caused warming had already measurably affected the global climate. It was also in this year that the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 4353, which declared climate change as a common concern of mankind, and also established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC's role was, and remains to this day, to regularly synthesize and update the scientific understanding of climate change for the world's policymakers. The IPCC produced its first assessment report on the state of climate change science in 1990, and they warned that, although there were many uncertainties, that human activity was leading to increased atmospheric CO2 concentrations and rising temperatures. The UNFCCC was formally opened for signature at the Rio Earth Summit in June 1992 and entered into force 2 years later in 1994. Under the convention, governments agreed to collect and disseminate information on greenhouse gas emissions, as well as on national policies and best practices. They agreed to launch national emissions abatement strategies and to cooperate in preparing for adaptation to climate change impacts. The UNFCCC established a framework for developing binding greenhouse gas emission limits. And importantly, the UNFCCC included different obligations for different countries through the doctrine of common but differentiated responsibilities, which is enshrined in Article 3.1 of the Convention. The UNFCCC is an example of a framework convention. Now, a framework convention is a type of treaty that's kind of like a shell. And that shell provides an architecture for the treaty regime of sort of broad guiding principles, but it doesn't have details on straightforward implementation. Those more detailed provisions crystallize over time. Another way to think of this using another metaphor is thinking of the framework convention like a skeleton in which the muscle is grown over time. So the fine detail is added through the negotiation of additional protocols and agreements. And these provide the rules and mechanisms that are more specific. So this is the meat on the bone. So the shell of the Framework Convention is a series of soft law, non-binding commitments and guiding principles that have the long-term objective of solidifying emissions reduction commitments into binding hard law. So soft law provisions are often vague and flexible, and these give the signatories to a convention wiggle room in their obligations. The vagueness of the soft law provisions leaves it up to states whether to implement the provisions. And this ambiguity, this is what's required in order to obtain as many signatories as possible. So this was particularly important in the early days of the UNFCCC to ensure maximum participation, to ensure that as many countries as possible initially signed up. Now, conversely, hard law generally consists of legally binding obligations that are really precise and that delegate authority for interpreting and implementing the law with very specific provisions. So this is what you see in the later negotiation of protocols and agreements in the UNFCCC, including the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 and then the Paris Agreement in 2015. Hard law additions to the Framework Convention are negotiated annually at Conference of Parties meetings, or COPs. The participants at each COP include the official government delegations of the signatory states, and each delegation has voting rights on all decisions. There are also official observers, so these can include NGOs or industry bodies or representatives of companies, and these observers can participate in the negotiations. They're in the tent, but they don't have voting rights. There's also a huge civil society presence around the fringes of each COP, and this is where environmental activists try to lobby the delegates who are inside, and they also host side events to draw publicity. So their role is to put pressure on the negotiations that are happening inside the COP. How the Conference of Parties functions procedurally is an important part of the story. So at each COP, there's a main plenary session where the parties negotiate an agenda for the conference, and then they sequentially work through that agenda over a 2-week period. The more complex agenda items are referred to working groups, and each working group follows a similar agenda format. The process follows standard diplomatic procedures that have developed over the past 2 centuries for multilateral negotiations, but this process, though predictable, can also be incredibly cumbersome. The agenda setting phase of the COP is often highly politicized, and this is where the parties try to advance their positions through their inclusion in the official agenda. States that have common interests do tend to group together into negotiating blocks, which you can see pictured here, and the negotiating blocks allow states to maximize their leverage through collective action. However, the major decisions do tend to revolve around negotiations between the great powers, between the most sort of larger and most important countries. And this is a process called minilateralism. So minilateralism does speed up the process of the COP, but it does exclude the voices of the smaller states. Also, a lot of the negotiations between the individuals in each delegation occur through what's called track 2 diplomacy. And this is more like informal chats in corridors and coffee shops. And this is where negotiators can work through sensitive issues, and they can trial new ideas with each other before they bring them into the formal negotiating process. Each Conference of Parties produces a number of different outcomes. So most important of these are the decisions, and these are the legally binding amendments that have been made to the treaty. Then come the resolutions, which are consensus opinions among the parties which have been negotiated, but which don't carry any legal obligations. Then there are the recommendations and conclusions, which are the negotiated outcomes and the reporting from the working groups. And finally, there's usually a statement from the conference chair which summarizes any unresolved issues that remain to be negotiated at the next Conference of Parties. Looking back, the Kyoto Protocol of 1997 was the first substantive hard law addition to the UNFCCC. It contained specific provisions outlining emissions reduction obligations for developed countries, along with additional schemes including emissions trading and the Clean Development Mechanism, which were intended to help facilitate emissions reductions internationally. Now, the Kyoto Protocol was an unprecedented agreement in international law in terms of its scope and objectives. Nonetheless, though, it was plagued by numerous problems related to compliance mechanisms, or lack thereof, as well as the flexibility of national emissions reduction targets. Because of these obstacles, a 2-track negotiating process emerged within the UNFCCC. So there was one to negotiate a second compliance period for the Kyoto Protocol, and the other negotiating track was to arrive at a successor agreement to the Kyoto Protocol, so what would eventually become the Paris Agreement. But one of the reasons why a successor agreement was necessary is because developing countries didn't have any emissions reduction obligations, and that was a source of great friction within the UNFCCC process. Another issue with Kyoto is that the protocol didn't include the US or China, who were the world's 2 largest greenhouse gas polluters. But also up until 2007, it didn't include Australia either, who was one of the largest per capita polluters in the world. Over that time period, less than 20 countries met their Kyoto emissions reduction targets. You had major cleavages develop within the UNFCCC process, which culminated in the disastrous failure of the 2009 Conference of Parties in Copenhagen. And this failure nearly imploded the UNFCCC completely, so that would have been a disaster. Developed and developing countries continued to disagree over the specifics of the doctrine of common but differentiated responsibilities, and this was highlighted most starkly by the divergent positions of the United States and China. So it took until 2015 to agree on a unified emissions reduction pathway for developed and developing countries, a full 18 years after the Kyoto Protocol. So this was much, much slower than intended. And that unified emissions agreement was the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was negotiated at the 21st UNFCCC Conference of Parties in Paris in November 2015. And looking back at how grindingly difficult the UNFCCC negotiations had been since the mid-90s, we do need to acknowledge the magnitude of the Paris Agreement as an unprecedented achievement in multilateral diplomacy. So if Kyoto was an unprecedented achievement back in 1997, the Paris Agreement built on that was even more of an achievement. Right up to COP21 in Paris, it wasn't clear that that two-track negotiating process that was born in the rubble of COP15 in Copenhagen was going to succeed. So make no mistake, Paris was the last gasp for the UNFCCC process. If they'd failed to arrive at a unified agreement at COP21, it would have likely decimated the UNFCCC regime permanently and destroyed any chance of an integrated global climate mitigation effort. The Paris Agreement introduced some new innovations into the Framework Convention. It introduced a new model of voluntary, nationally determined contributions which governments had to make on a regular basis, or NDCs. Each country's NDC is specific to its domestic circumstances and capabilities, and that's a flexibility that reflects common but differentiated responsibilities and allows for developed and developing countries to pursue different emissions reduction trajectories. From this year, NDCs are to be submitted every 5 years to the UNFCCC Secretariat, and this is based on the idea that each successive NDC will commit a country to more expansive emissions reduction targets than their previous NDC. So it's meant to be incrementally more powerful. While it's still early days, we can view the Paris Agreement as both a success on one hand and a work in progress on the other. So on the plus side, it has united developed and developing countries with obligations under one agreement, where previously only developed countries carried emissions reduction obligations under Kyoto. A major strength of the Paris Agreement is its near universal participation and acceptance of responsibility by almost every country in the world. At COP24 in Katowice in Poland in 2018, the parties agreed on the Paris Rulebook, which details how countries measure, report and verify their emissions budgets, their NDCs, and contributions or applications for climate adaptation funding. It also documents the rules for voluntary market mechanisms like carbon trading. Also, the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature stabilisation target, which is aimed to limit the rise of greenhouse gas emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, was brought in officially into the UNFCCC at Paris, where previously the previous consensus target was 2 degrees Celsius. So this change reflected long-standing scientific recommendations, and indeed the fact that it took so long for 1.5 degrees Celsius to come in, again, is a testament to how slow it is to get things done through the UNFCCC process. If we're looking for a theme alert, lack of pace and urgency really is the thing to watch when we're looking at the downsides to the Paris Agreement. So for one, the emissions reduction obligations are still voluntary, and the agreement doesn't really have any real enforcement mechanisms beyond peer pressure. And this is a problem given that there's no way the reduction targets that the countries have collectively pledged to date can cap emissions at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this is what we see illustrated in the graphic here. Now that the structural foundations to a binding agreement covering all parties have been laid out in the Paris Agreement, further progress in the UNFCCC process will require countries to start making some real sacrifices to meet their climate mitigation objectives. There's many other elements to the agreement, including climate adaptation finance, which also merits attention. A key sticking point here was the issue of funds transfer to least developed countries, because developed countries didn't want to be the only ones paying the costs. The Paris Agreement certainly isn't perfect, and it's clearly not enough to reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature stabilisation target. But it's the best treaty we have at the present time, so you've got to work with what you've got. I do encourage you to closely read the text of the Paris Agreement. And if you're so inclined, go back and read the text of the Kyoto Protocol and the original text of the UNFCCC treaty. And have a look at the Conference of Parties outcomes from subsequent COPs as well. In these words, you can tease out all of the contentious issues, all of the disagreements, and all of the compromises that have permeated international climate politics over several decades. And you can see it in the wording. These problems keep recurring, and you see the same kind of language through each text. I've linked to some of these on LMS, but you can also find them through the UNFCCC website as well.